Here is someone who was an extraordinary and utterly inspirational talent, and who was able to shine internationally at a time when South Africa, for very good reasons, wasn't shining. So an extraordinary inspirational story, I think, for South Africans coming out of a very difficult time. Then someone who came home and who tried to be part of the change that was happening, and perhaps got caught up in the worst of our new moment, and saw very tragically, I think, the gloss taken off.
As a boy in South Africa, Sidney Maree used to run to the store for his mother, but before he could compete in world-class events, he had to leave home. International track and field organizations are boycotting South Africa's apartheid policies, but by not letting athletes from there compete, well, Sidney Maree has become one of the world's best middle-distance runners. But in 1981, when he set a new world's record for the 1,500 meters, he was a man without a country. His travel document said stateless.
I want to know, I want people to take a closer look at what the truth is.
I loved running. I lived with my Aunt Leah and Aunt Aniki. Auntie Aniki was quite a big disciplinarian. I remember many times she would spit on a rock in the sun and tell me, you better be back from the store, which was about 2-3 k's away, with the bread or the sugar that she had sent me to buy. So if I came back and the spit had dried, I would be punished. So in a way, inadvertently, I was training to become a runner.
Sidney had a lot of determination. Every weekend I used to take him to the mines to go and compete against the athletes that were trained on the mines.
It was discovered that he had some running talent, and so he represented himself in his school really well at Vlakfontein, and that garnered him some national attention. The thing that really turned the tide for him after this national attention was getting invited to the Vernon Barnes Memorial. They were hoping that he would pace a college runner at that time, Clive Dale, who had been trying to break the 4-minute mile barrier, which still had this huge romantic appeal.
I was then invited as a pacemaker, but I was not told. I only found out later.
Clive Dale was the person who was supposed to go and break the dream mile. And for Clive Dale to do that, they had to get a strong team to help Clive Dale. They had to get strong people who can pull Clive Dale for at least 3 laps. Sidney entered as an underdog.
He already was scared. It's the first integrated race he'd ever been in where he raced against whites, and he'd been taught that whites were superior in every way. He'd been raised with that belief kind of throughout his life.
At the 200-meter mark, Sidney pulled.
Coming into the 4th lap, the crowd started to go crazy, and so he thought, this must mean Clive Dale is on my butt and is about to pass me any second, so he really picked it up.
He was surprised to see a shadow of himself. He thought Clive Dale was coming to pass him, and Sidney ran like a rocket.
I thought it was Clive Dale.
And it turned out it was just him. Clive Dale was 15 meters back, nowhere near him, but the crowd, meanwhile, was going insane for him.
Everybody stood up on the pavilion to cheer Sidney, and no longer Clive Dale, who was left well behind, where nobody thought a black man would run as Sidney was running.
That then opened doors for me to go to America. I was invited to go and visit by the Philadelphia Pioneers, to come and visit in Philadelphia. While I was there, Villanova University recruited me.
There were sporting sanctions against South Africans, and in the eyes of the world, he was South African. So even though in South Africa he had no citizenship rights as a black man, he couldn't vote, he couldn't own land, but to the rest of the world, he was South African.
In South Africa, I suffered because of the color of my skin. Overseas, I'm suffering because they say I'm South African. And yet in South Africa, I was not being recognized as being South African. The sad part about my career in the beginning was when one would arrive at a track meet and you would warm up, and as you are about to toe the line, you would be told that, sorry, you are South African, you could not compete because your running would contaminate the other athletes. They had what they then called the contamination rule.
He met his wife, Lisa Roden, the year before he graduated, his junior year in 1980, and they married actually that same year in December. And so at that point, he actually began the process of becoming a U.S. citizen. In all of those years, he realized things were not changing in South Africa, and they wouldn't change quick enough for him to be able to express himself as an athlete on the international stage.
I remember being very young, and I think it was because he would tell stories, and the fact that like people would be in such awe, I think I started to realize like, wow, he's kind of like something big. For me, he was just my dad, but I really kind of understood that he, I guess maybe was good at what he did.
For me, the most exciting part was towards the end of summer. We then had the Fifth Avenue Mile in New York, the inaugural Fifth Avenue Mile. None of us had ever run on the road before. We had no idea how to pace ourselves.
It was the first time Sydney was able to run in a world-class field, and in fact Sports Illustrated said it was the best mile field ever assembled to that point in the mile.
The first 400 meters within that mile race was run in 52 seconds, faster than even an 800-meter runner would run. Within the second half of that race, I was praying very hard, saying I would never go out that hard again, but my momentum propelled me over the tape.
The coloured South African who came to live in the States comes right away to win the Fifth Avenue Mile.
And was then crowned the champion. The record still stands today
as the fastest mile ever run by man.
I don't think that there's any other former world record holder that's a U.S. citizen who's not in the Hall of Fame. And in fact, some of the runners who are in the Hall of Fame have far less credentials than what Sydney had.
His life mirrors the evolution of South African society from apartheid to democracy.
Everybody would try to get him to talk, but he was conscious that he was an important symbol for the new South Africa, so he was always kind of cautious, measured. It was that image that I'll always have of Sidney Maree, that quiet, progressive, noble man for the new South Africa that stuck in my mind and was really a motivating factor when I saw my first news accounts of where he was today.
I'd always had a fascination with the World Cup. My editor said, we want you to go over there, we want you to cover soccer, we want you to follow the U.S. and do all of that, but the number one thing we want you to come back with is a story on Sidney Maree.
I applied for him to be inducted in the Hall of Fame, which he still hasn't been. And through that year, made plans to meet up with him in South Africa. Within 6 weeks of when I was supposed to go, I lost contact with him. All of a sudden, my emails were bouncing back.
They just knew that something had gone wrong. While I was in South Africa, if I could just dig a little deeper to find out what it was that had happened to him. I think they knew that he either had been arrested or was in jail. They knew there was legal troubles, but there just wasn't a lot of information on him.
Corruption over there is just really easy to come by.
I think that Sidney's biggest guilt, perhaps, was a certain naivete. To expect that everyone acted in an honorable way.
I wasn't clear on the facts, but I knew that there was some sort of investigation regarding alleged fraud.
You could just tell there was something that wasn't right. It's such a compelling story that more people should be taking notice even now.
You know, there's a lot of time that you can't make up